There is a peculiar tension that defines modern life. We are encouraged to be expressive, yet subtly trained to remain emotionally controlled. We are told to be ourselves, but only in ways that do not inconvenience productivity, social harmony, or efficiency. As a result, many of us live with a quiet contradiction inside, feeling deeply yet rarely allowing those feelings to fully surface. This tension does not announce itself dramatically. It hums beneath the surface of everyday life, shaping how we work, love, and think about ourselves. At first glance, nothing seems wrong. We function, we meet deadlines, we maintain relationships, we smile at the appropriate moments. But beneath this apparent normality lies a persistent sense of emotional compression, a feeling that something essential is being held back. Modern individuals often report vague discomfort rather than overt suffering, a dull restlessness, an unexplained fatigue, a sense of emotional flatness. We may struggle to articulate what is missing because we have become so skilled at overriding our inner signals. Phenomenologically, this suppression feels like living one step removed from oneself. Emotions arise, but they are quickly evaluated, filtered, and neutralized. Anger becomes irritation, sadness becomes tiredness, longing becomes distraction. This is not accidental. From early childhood, many of us learn that certain emotions are inconvenient, embarrassing, or unsafe. Over time, the body adapts, muscles tense reflexively, breath becomes shallow, attention shifts outward rather than inward. The nervous system learns to prioritize control over expression. This creates an inner split. On one side is the private emotional reality, raw, contradictory, sometimes overwhelming. On the other is the socially acceptable self, composed, reasonable, and emotionally appropriate. The cost of maintaining this split is subtle but cumulative. Carl Jung referred to this disowned emotional territory as the shadow self. Aspects of our inner life that are denied expression and therefore gain power in indirect ways. What is not felt consciously does not disappear, it simply moves underground. Modern life intensifies this dynamic through constant stimulation and evaluation. Notifications, metrics, and social comparison keep attention externalized. There is little space for emotional digestion. Feelings require slowness, ambiguity, and presence, conditions that modern environments systematically erode. We learn to self-regulate not through understanding, but through suppression. The result is a population that is emotionally functional, but inwardly disoriented. This documentary begins with that quiet contradiction, not as a pathology, but as a shared condition. To understand how modern life trains us to suppress our feelings, we must first acknowledge the subtle ways this suppression feels normal, even virtuous. Only then can we begin to recognize the cost of living without full access to our emotional selves. One of the most troubling aspects of emotional suppression is that it rarely announces itself as a problem. Instead, it appears as a collection of subtle habits, behaviors so normalized that they are often mistaken for personality traits or maturity. We call ourselves low maintenance, rational, or not very emotional. Without realizing these labels may describe adaptations rather than authentic dispositions. Psychologically, the earliest signs emerge in how we relate to discomfort. Many people notice an almost automatic urge to distract themselves the moment an unpleasant feeling arises. Sadness invites scrolling. Anxiety demands productivity. Anger is swallowed and rebranded as politeness. This reflexive avoidance is not laziness or lack of insight. It is a learned survival strategy. The nervous system has been trained to associate emotional expression with risk, social rejection, conflict, or loss of control. Behaviorally, emotional suppression often manifests as chronic busyness. The individual feels uneasy in moments of stillness, as though silence might allow something unwanted to surface. Burnout culture thrives on this dynamic. Exhaustion becomes preferable to introspection. From the outside, such individuals appear disciplined and driven. Internally, they are running from their own emotional landscape. Another common sign is emotional mislabeling. Instead of identifying precise feelings, people rely on vague descriptors like fine, stressed, or tired. This phenomenon, known in psychology as alexithymia, reflects a diminished capacity to recognize and name emotions. Without language, feelings lose coherence. They remain as bodily sensations: tightness in the chest, heaviness in the limbs, irritability without context. The mind interprets these sensations as problems to be solved rather than messages to be understood. Relationships quietly absorb the consequences. Suppressed emotions do not vanish, they leak. They emerge as passive aggression, emotional withdrawal, or sudden disproportionate reactions. A minor disagreement triggers overwhelming defensiveness. A small disappointment feels strangely devastating. These reactions often confuse both the individual and those around them, reinforcing the belief that emotions are unreliable and dangerous. Cognitively, emotional suppression fuels cognitive dissonance. We sense an inner truth, loneliness, resentment, grief, yet continue to act as though nothing is wrong. Maintaining this contradiction requires constant psychological effort. Over time, this effort drains vitality and clarity. Life begins to feel performative rather than lived. Perhaps the most insidious sign is the erosion of joy. Pleasure becomes muted, fleeting, or strangely unsatisfying. Neuroscience offers insight here. Emotional suppression dampens not only negative emotions, but positive ones as well. The same neural circuits involved in emotional regulation influence dopamine and serotonin pathways. When we habitually inhibit feeling, we flatten the entire emotional spectrum. These signs do not indicate personal failure. They are the fingerprints of adaptation in an environment that rewards emotional restraint. To recognize them is not to assign blame, but to begin seeing the invisible cost of living in quiet emotional exile. To understand how emotional suppression becomes so deeply ingrained, we must look beneath behavior and into mechanism, into the architecture of the brain, the logic of evolution, and the unconscious strategies that govern survival. Emotional suppression is not merely a social habit. It is a neurobiological adaptation shaped by repeated experience. At the neurological level, emotions originate in subcortical regions such as the amygdala, which rapidly assesses threat and relevance. In a healthy system, emotional signals travel upward to the prefrontal cortex, where meaning, context, and response are integrated. However, when emotional expression repeatedly leads to negative outcomes, shame, punishment, rejection, the brain learns to interrupt this process. The prefrontal cortex begins to inhibit emotional output before it reaches conscious awareness. Over time, this inhibition becomes automatic. This pattern is reinforced by stress hormones. Chronic exposure to pressure, deadlines, evaluation, financial insecurity keeps cortisol levels elevated. High cortisol suppresses emotional nuance while sharpening task-oriented focus. In evolutionary terms, this makes sense. For early humans, emotional narrowing under threat increased survival, but modern threats are abstract and constant. The body reacts as if danger never ends, locking the nervous system into a prolonged state of emotional restriction. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, suppression is also relational. Humans evolved in small groups where social exclusion was fatal. Expressing emotions that risked group cohesion, anger, grief, vulnerability, had to be carefully managed. Modern life amplifies this ancient fear. Social media introduces perpetual observation. Workplaces reward emotional neutrality. Algorithms favor positivity or outrage, but not complexity. The unconscious conclusion is clear: certain feelings are unsafe to express. Freud described this process as repression, the pushing of unacceptable thoughts and emotions into the unconscious. Jung expanded this idea, arguing that what is repressed does not disappear, but becomes autonomous. The shadow self acts out through compulsions, projections, and somatic symptoms. Modern neuroscience supports this insight. Suppressed emotions remain active in the limbic system, influencing behavior without entering awareness. The body remembers what the mind avoids. Another mechanism at play is cognitive dissonance. When lived experience conflicts with self-image, I am successful, therefore I should be content. The mind resolves the tension not by changing circumstances, but by invalidating feelings. Emotional signals are reframed as irrational or weak. Over time, this internal gaslighting erodes trust in one's own perceptions. Neurochemically, suppression alters reward systems. Dopamine, associated with motivation and anticipation, becomes tied to distraction and achievement rather than emotional fulfillment. Serotonin, linked to mood regulation and social bonding, diminishes when authentic connection is absent. This imbalance explains why suppressed individuals often feel driven but unsatisfied, constantly moving, rarely arriving. Crucially, none of this is conscious choice. The psyche is doing what it has learned to do to survive. Emotional suppression is not a flaw in character. It is an intelligence adapted to an environment that confuses safety with silence. Understanding the mechanism does not immediately free us, but it restores compassion. And compassion is the first condition for change.
Emotional suppression is not merely an individual phenomenon, it is embedded within the social and historical architecture of modern life. To understand why suppressing feelings feels so normal, even virtuous, we must compare the psychological demands of earlier human environments with those of contemporary society. For most of human history, emotional expression occurred within small, stable communities. Grief, anger, fear, and joy were shared in collective rituals. Mourning, storytelling, physical labor, and communal rest. Emotions had a place, a time, and witnesses. They were metabolized socially. Today, however, emotional life has been privatized. We are expected to process complex inner states alone, often silently, while maintaining outward functionality. Industrialization marked a major psychological shift. Efficiency, punctuality, and standardization became moral values. Emotional expression, unpredictable and inefficient, was increasingly seen as a liability. The modern workplace inherited this logic. Professionalism became synonymous with emotional restraint. To feel deeply was acceptable. To show, it was not. Over generations, this ethic migrated from factories and offices into identities. Capitalism further intensified this dynamic by commodifying attention and productivity. Time spent feeling became time not producing. Emotions that could be monetized, desire, envy, aspiration, were amplified. Emotions that slowed consumption, contentment, grief, contemplation, were sidelined. The psyche adapted accordingly, prioritizing drive over depth. Technology accelerated the fragmentation of emotional experience. Social media platforms reward visibility, but not vulnerability. Algorithms favor extremes, celebration or outrage, while subtle, ambiguous emotions disappear into silence. Individuals learn to curate emotional personas rather than inhabit emotional truths. This creates a paradoxical loneliness, constant connection without emotional intimacy. Historically, repression was once enforced externally, through rigid moral codes and overt authority. Today, suppression is internalized. We police ourselves. We measure emotional expression against imagined judgments. Michel Foucault observed that modern power operates most effectively when it becomes self-regulation. Emotional suppression is a psychological expression of this principle. Culturally, many societies now valorize independence to the point of emotional isolation. Needing others is framed as weakness. Self-sufficiency replaces mutual reliance. From an attachment theory perspective, this mirrors avoidant attachment patterns, where closeness is equated with loss of autonomy. Entire cultures begin to mirror individual defense mechanisms. Comparatively, cultures that preserve collective emotional rituals, shared meals, mourning practices, extended family structures, show lower rates of emotional alienation. This is not nostalgia, it is psychological evidence that emotions require communal containment. When society withdraws that container, individuals compensate through suppression. Modern life did not create emotional suppression, but it refined it, rewarded it, and normalized it. What once was a temporary survival strategy has become a permanent mode of being. Recognizing this historical and social context shifts the narrative from personal inadequacy to collective design. The question then becomes not, "What is wrong with me?" but, "What kind of world have I been trained to survive in?" The suppression of emotion does not remain confined within the individual. It inevitably reshapes how we relate to others. Relationships, which depend on emotional exchange, begin to reflect the same restraint, distortion, and avoidance learned internally. What emerges is not an absence of connection, but a thinning of it, a closeness that feels technically intact, yet emotionally incomplete. One of the first casualties is emotional attunement. When individuals are disconnected from their own feelings, they struggle to recognize and respond to the emotions of others. Conversations remain polite but shallow. Vulnerability feels awkward or excessive. Partners, friends, and family members may sense that something is missing, yet find it difficult to articulate what. This often leads to a quiet dissatisfaction on both sides, mistaken for incompatibility rather than emotional inaccessibility. Attachment theory offers a useful lens here. Suppressed emotional environments tend to produce avoidant or anxious attachment styles. Avoidantly attached individuals learn to downplay needs and withdraw when intimacy increases. Anxiously attached individuals sense emotional unavailability and respond by intensifying pursuit. These patterns create relational feedback loops, distance provoking anxiety, anxiety provoking further distance. Neither party feels safe enough to express what they truly feel. Emotional suppression also distorts conflict. Healthy conflict requires the capacity to tolerate discomfort and express feelings without collapsing or attacking. In suppressed systems, conflict becomes either explosive or entirely absent. Some relationships avoid disagreement altogether, maintaining superficial harmony at the cost of authenticity. Others erupt over minor issues, releasing years of unspoken resentment in a single moment. In both cases, emotions are experienced as threats rather than information. Modern loneliness is deeply tied to this phenomenon. Many people are not isolated in the literal sense. They are surrounded by colleagues, acquaintances, even partners. Yet they report feeling unseen. This loneliness stems not from lack of contact, but from lack of emotional witnessing. To be seen requires allowing internal states to be known. Suppression makes this feel unsafe, even with those closest to us. Social media further complicates relational dynamics. Emotional expression becomes performative rather than relational. Feelings are broadcast, but not metabolized. Validation replaces understanding. The nervous system learns to associate emotional disclosure with metrics, likes, views, responses, rather than mutual presence. This undermines genuine intimacy and reinforces emotional self-monitoring. Over time, relationships formed under emotional suppression begin to feel transactional. Care is expressed through actions rather than presence. Love is demonstrated through reliability, not openness. While these forms are not meaningless, they often leave a residue of emotional hunger. People begin to feel lonely within connection, a paradox that is both confusing and painful. Ultimately, emotional suppression fragments relationships in subtle ways. It teaches us to be together without truly meeting, to speak without revealing, to touch without arriving. Understanding this impact is not an indictment of modern relationships, but an invitation to see what they are missing and why. The suppression of emotion does not remain confined within the individual. It inevitably reshapes how we relate to others. Relationships, which depend on emotional exchange, begin to reflect the same restraint, distortion, and avoidance learned internally. What emerges is not an absence of connection, but a thinning of it, a closeness that feels technically intact, yet emotionally incomplete. One of the first casualties is emotional attunement. When individuals are disconnected from their own feelings, they struggle to recognize and respond to the emotions of others. Conversations remain polite but shallow. Vulnerability feels awkward or excessive. Partners, friends, and family members may sense that something is missing, yet find it difficult to articulate what. This often leads to a quiet dissatisfaction on both sides, mistaken for incompatibility rather than emotional inaccessibility. Attachment theory offers a useful lens here. Suppressed emotional environments tend to produce avoidant or anxious attachment styles. Avoidantly attached individuals learn to downplay needs and withdraw when intimacy increases. Anxiously attached individuals sense emotional unavailability and respond by intensifying pursuit. These patterns create relational feedback loops, distance provoking anxiety, anxiety provoking further distance. Neither party feels safe enough to express what they truly feel. Emotional suppression also distorts conflict. Healthy conflict requires the capacity to tolerate discomfort and express feelings without collapsing or attacking. In suppressed systems, conflict becomes either explosive or entirely absent. Some relationships avoid disagreement altogether, maintaining superficial harmony at the cost of authenticity. Others erupt over minor issues, releasing years of unspoken resentment in a single moment. In both cases, emotions are experienced as threats rather than information. Modern loneliness is deeply tied to this phenomenon. Many people are not isolated in the literal sense. They are surrounded by colleagues, acquaintances, even partners. Yet they report feeling unseen. This loneliness stems not from lack of contact, but from lack of emotional witnessing. To be seen requires allowing internal states to be known. Suppression makes this feel unsafe, even with those closest to us. Social media further complicates relational dynamics. Emotional expression becomes performative rather than relational. Feelings are broadcast, but not metabolized. Validation replaces understanding. The nervous system learns to associate emotional disclosure with metrics, likes, views, responses, rather than mutual presence. This undermines genuine intimacy and reinforces emotional self-monitoring. Over time, relationships formed under emotional suppression begin to feel transactional. Care is expressed through actions rather than presence. Love is demonstrated through reliability, not openness. While these forms are not meaningless, they often leave a residue of emotional hunger. People begin to feel lonely within connection, a paradox that is both confusing and painful. Ultimately, emotional suppression fragments relationships in subtle ways. It teaches us to be together without truly meeting, to speak without revealing, to touch without arriving. Understanding this impact is not an indictment of modern relationships, but an invitation to see what they are missing and why. Healing from emotional suppression does not begin with expression. It begins with permission. Permission to feel without immediately correcting, explaining, or fixing. For many, this is unfamiliar territory. The nervous system, trained for restraint, initially interprets openness as danger. Anxiety often increases before it decreases. This is not regression, it is thawing. The first step is rebuilding emotional literacy. Feelings must be named before they can be integrated. This process engages the prefrontal cortex in a different way, not to inhibit emotion, but to witness it. Research in affective neuroscience shows that simply labeling emotions reduces amygdala activation. Language becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. I feel sad is not indulgence, it is regulation. Equally important is learning to tolerate ambivalence. Suppressed individuals often believe emotions must be consistent, rational, or justified. In reality, the psyche holds contradictions. Love can coexist with resentment. Gratitude can exist alongside grief. Jung viewed psychological health not as coherence, but as the capacity to hold opposites without collapse. Acceptance is not agreement, it is allowance. The body plays a central role in recovery. Emotional suppression lives somatically: tight jaws, collapsed posture, shallow breathing. Somatic therapies, breathwork, and mindful movement restore communication between sensation and emotion. Trauma research emphasizes that insight alone is insufficient. The body must learn safety. When the body feels safe, emotions no longer need to hide. Relational healing is equally crucial. Suppression often formed in relationships. It must be healed in relationships. This does not mean dramatic confession, but gradual risk-taking. Small truths spoken, small needs expressed. Secure attachment develops not through perfection, but through repair. Being met imperfectly is still being met. Boundaries also emerge differently through healing. Rather than walls built from numbness, boundaries become conscious limits rooted in self-respect. Saying no no longer requires emotional shutdown. Anger becomes information, not threat. Sadness becomes signal, not weakness. This reframing transforms emotions from enemies into allies. Importantly, healing does not aim to make life comfortable. Feeling more means feeling pain more clearly, but it also means feeling joy, intimacy, and meaning more vividly. The goal is not emotional intensity, but emotional honesty. A life that can be felt is not always easy, but it is real. Acceptance, in its deepest form, is the recognition that nothing within us is accidental. Our defenses formed for reasons. Our numbness once protected us. To heal is not to reject these adaptations, but to thank them and then gently outgrow them.
At its core, emotional suppression reflects a misunderstanding of what it means to be human. Modern life teaches us to equate control with maturity, composure with wisdom, and emotional restraint with strength. Yet philosophy has long suggested the opposite, that a meaningful life is not one in which emotions are mastered, but one in which they are understood and integrated. Existential thinkers argued that anxiety, grief, and longing are not pathologies to eliminate, but signals of consciousness confronting reality. Søren Kierkegaard viewed anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, the price we pay for having inner depth. To suppress emotion, then, is not merely to avoid pain, but to avoid aliveness itself. We shrink the range of experience in order to feel safe, and in doing so, we quietly abandon parts of our humanity. Jung believed that wholeness arises not from perfection, but from integration. The task of life is not to become purely positive, calm, or functional, but to reconcile light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, reason and feeling. What we refuse to feel fragments us. What we allow to be felt begins to organize us from within. Emotional honesty becomes an ethical act toward the self. From this perspective, modern emotional suppression is not a personal failure, but a cultural tragedy. A society that cannot tolerate feeling produces individuals who cannot tolerate themselves. When emotions are seen as inconveniences, people learn to treat their inner lives as obstacles rather than sources of meaning. Life becomes efficient, but hollow. Yet there is a quiet hope embedded in this realization. Because suppression is learned, it can be unlearned. Not all at once, and not without discomfort, but gently, through attention. Each moment of noticing a feeling without fleeing it is an act of resistance against a culture of numbness. Each honest conversation reclaims a small piece of emotional territory. To feel deeply in the modern world is not indulgent, it is courageous. It requires moving against the current of speed, performance, and distraction. It asks us to slow down enough to listen, to sadness before it hardens into despair, to anger before it turns into bitterness, to longing before it collapses into emptiness. In the end, the question is not whether we can afford to feel, it is whether we can afford not to. A life unfelt may be easier to manage, but it is harder to inhabit. Meaning does not emerge from control, but from contact, from being in touch with what is alive within us. Perhaps the quiet work of our time is not self-optimization, but self-recovery. Not becoming better versions of ourselves, but more honest ones. And in that honesty, imperfect, vulnerable, deeply human, we may rediscover what modern life so often trains us to forget, that our feelings are not the problem, they are the way home.